Good evening, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Anna Mahoney, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nelson A. Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences. It's my pleasure to welcome both in-person and virtual attendees who are with us for this program. For those joining us in person, please note that recording or photographing this program is not permitted. This event is the final program in the 2024 election series, part of the fall 2024 term Government and Public Policy course, the 2024 election, taught by Professor Russell Muirhead, Professor Herschel Nachlass, and Professor William Wohlforth. The course and speaker series were truly impactful in engaging our students with scholars and policymakers about issues central to the 2024 election. We are so grateful and honored to have Professor Anita Hill as our final speaker in this series. During my first 2 weeks here at Dartmouth, Herschel and I spoke about our ambitions for what we'd like to accomplish in our new roles at Rocky. As many of you know, Herschel likes to walk and talk, and as we circled Occam Pond, I shared my dream would be to introduce our students to Professor Hill. I thought this was a shoot for the moon and end up in the stars kind of idea. Little did I know that Herschel, too, with his development of a law and policy initiative at Rocky, shared my dream. When the Hop suggested we might engage Professor Hill in conversation with Anna Deavere Smith, well, you can imagine the idea went even beyond a moonshot. We are so excited for this evening's program, so let me tell you a little more about the folks who made tonight possible. This program is being presented as the William H. Timbers Lecture, Class of 37, established in memory of the Honorable William H. Timbers by the legal firm Skadden, Arps, Slate, Meagher, and Flom, for whom Timbers once practiced. The Rockefeller Center could not have made this program possible without our many cross-campus partners, and we would like to extend our sincere gratitude to Dartmouth Dialogues, Institutional Diversity and Equity, the Ethics Institute, the Center for Business, Government, and Society at Tuck, the Institute for Black Intellectual and Cultural Life, and Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Our special thanks goes out to the Hopkins Center and Montgomery Fellows, our co-sponsors who partnered with us in bringing our incredible moderator, Anna Deavere Smith, to Dartmouth for this program. Anna, a Montgomery Fellow and frequent guest of the Hopkins Center for the Arts, joins us with support from both of these Dartmouth partners. I would love to now invite Steve Swain, Jacob H. Strauss, 1922 Professor of Music and Director of the Montgomery Fellows Program, to the stage to help us introduce our guest speakers. Thank you.
Indeed, I'm Steve Swain, a professor of music here and the director of the college's Montgomery Fellows Program. We gather today on the ancestral homelands of the Western Abenaki, who were and are part of the Wabanaki Confederation. The two women we are here to hear today grace our campus by their presence. Their relationship, as it happens, predates today's events. Ms. Smith is developing a theater piece based on the life of Ms. Hill. So bringing them together allows us to bear witness to their creativity and their camaraderie. As you've already heard, Ms. Smith is no stranger to our campus, having already stepped foot here as a Montgomery Fellow in fall of 2015 and having performed as an artist in the Hopkins Center for the Performing Arts. Let me tell you a little bit more about Ms. Smith. Anna Deavere Smith is credited with having created a new form of theater. Her plays, which focus on contemporary issues from multiple points of view, are composed of interview excerpts. President Obama awarded Smith a National Endowment for the Humanities Medal. She is the recipient of the MacArthur Fellowship, several Obie Awards, and the George Polk Career Award in Journalism. She was a runner-up for the Pulitzer Prize and nominated for 2 Tony Awards. Plays and films based on them include Fires in the Mirror, Twilight Los Angeles, Let Me Down Easy, and Notes from the Field. Television and film acting includes Inventing Anna, The West Wing, Nurse Jackie, Blackish, Philadelphia, The American President, and Rachel Getting Married. As you heard, she is a professor at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. Last year, she was the Eastman Professor at Oxford University. She has several honorary doctorate degrees, including those from some school down in Cambridge, another one down in New Haven, Spelman College, Juilliard, Oxford, and this illustrious institution. Equally illustrious is Ms. Hill, whose participation in the Rockefeller Center's 24 election speaker series, you heard how it was made possible. Unlike Ms. Smith, this is Ms. Hill's first visit to Dartmouth. Let's be sure it's not her last. Anita Hill is an award-winning author and a professor of law, social policy, and women and gender studies at Brandeis University. The youngest of 13 children from a farm in rural Oklahoma, she received her JD from Yale Law School and began her career in private practice. Anita Hill is credited with bringing the discussion of workplace sexual harassment into public consciousness with her landmark testimony against Supreme Court nominee Clarence Thomas in 1991. Since then, she has dedicated her career to increasing awareness of and bringing an end to gender-based violence. Her most recent book, Believing Our 30-Year Journey to End Gender Violence, is the winner of the 2022 American Bar Association Silver Gavel Award, the ABA's highest honor for works that foster the American public's understanding of law and the legal system. She is a fierce advocate for equality and civil rights and believes it is our communal duty to end gender violence. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anita Hill and Professor Anna Deavere Smith.
So, just in being reminded that you are one of 13 children who grew up in a farming town, I just can't resist asking, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this?
I know. How did I get
How did you
here?
get, think
Yeah.
of it. How did you get from there to here? We know about one very important episode in your life, but let's imagine if that hadn't happened. How did you get from there to here?
Well, I think I think I would have gotten here anyway. I don't think one episode actually shapes your entire life. I'd like to believe that I got here anyway, but my career really was not linear. My path wasn't linear. I went to law school at Yale. I left and went to Washington. Then I moved back to Oklahoma. Then I taught at 2 schools in Oklahoma, including Oral Roberts University, and then Oklahoma University. And then I heard a little reaction when I said Oral Roberts University. And now I'm at Brandeis, and and the distance between those 2 institutions
Just right there.
That is really is bigger than the distance between Oklahoma and Massachusetts. But how I got there, is also the answer to the question of how I moved on beyond the incident or the situation that people probably know more about, and that is I got there by continuing to believe in what I believed in the law in terms of the importance of the law, the need for the law to produce equality affirmatively, not simply just, accidentally. And my belief that I could play a role in making that happen. And so how I got here was a lot of hard work, and maybe that's what growing up on a farm does.
You wrote in New York Times op-ed supporting Kamala Harris last fall. You noted that one of her tasks would be, here's a quote from you, restoring reputational respect for our legal system. It will require the rebuilding of confidence in our Supreme Court's willingness to protect basic rights enshrined in our laws and in legal precedent that makes clear that we've moved beyond the historical understandings that freedom, rights, and liberty are limited to the powerful and rich. In a recent poll, many Americans said they'd lack trust in the Supreme Court, indeed confidence in and approval of the court, that they are at near historic lows. So let us unpack that a little bit. It's related to a student question, which was, what are specific steps that government should take to return the Supreme Court to an unbiased, non-political entity? So let's unpack that incredible paragraph that you wrote last fall, what you're thinking now about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm not naive enough to think that the Supreme Court has never been political. But typically, when you think of the politics of the Supreme Court, you think, at least historically, you think about individual justices on the court who have stronger political ties than other justices do. Right now, what we have is a court that, with a 6-3 majority, a majority of whom are there because of an affiliation with an organization with a political aim to pack the court, in a sense, with people who were conservative in thought. And part of that structure included not only setting up chapters of the Federalist Society in law schools, but also bringing in members of the Supreme Court to meetings and events, and then really setting up a roster, essentially, for who should be nominated, who a conservative president would nominate to fill a seat on the Supreme Court. So there was direct interaction with a pool of people to be put on the Supreme Court. And it's something, and I think that kind of activity, I don't know anywhere in history where that has happened, whether we're talking about Supreme Court justices who are liberal or conservative. I think it is new to the system. It is why people feel that the court is much more political now than ever. It has a different feel to it. But I also think that we have to understand what that ultimately means for the public. And that, I think, is the reason that the public does not have confidence. The public sees this as politics similar to the politics of the elected officials who sign up as Democrats and Republicans, and that's their political banner. But the presumption was, I think always has been, that the politics should not invade the court, because the courts really have to review the politicians. And so I think we are just at a very different time and a different approach to filling Supreme Court seats. And that if we continue in this way, we're not necessarily going to have voices on the court that the public feels either trust in or confidence in, nor do they feel that their ideas are represented at all in any way or another. And so I think we all start to lose out if we don't have that court, the court that to some extent, at least, to the very extent at least, is there because they are the best legal minds in the country, as opposed to their political affiliations. So
How do we work our, what's going to, you felt that Kamala Harris would have to rebuild our confidence. So you must have some ideas about how that ideally would have begun to happen. What are some of those ideas?
I don't know that I do. I didn't say that in the piece. I didn't write that paragraph.
Oh, I thought maybe
I haven't
you did,
gotten
and
to it. There's so
I
much
thought
has
maybe you
happened
did it,
since
the time's
then.
cut it.
Well, I didn't write that, but I do think that on some level, I mean, because the president is always the one to make a nomination. And the president, I would say, in order to fulfill that responsibility to the American public, needs to engage in how do we make the nomination process more fair, more clear to the American public that it is not just a political position that is happening, that it is something that is a measure of our commitment to our laws and to our Constitution, more than our commitment to policies and preferences that politicians may have. And so I think that is the start. How do you, one, inform the public of what is the appropriate role of the court? And then the system for selecting judges at this point in time is just fraught with just mistakes and anger and innuendo. Yeah, but let me just put it this way. It is, I mean, if you think back, I think it was year 2022, 23. If you think back on the nomination hearing for Ketanji Brown Jackson, that was a disgrace. It was really a disgrace because it cheated the public out of having a fair hearing and understanding of the thinking, the judicial thinking of a nominee. It cheated the public out of having a fair understanding of the integrity of the nominee. It was, I wouldn't even call it I would say, how to even describe it. It was not a hearing at all. It was an attempt to actually convict her based on false information. And it was not befitting the Senate, but it certainly did damage to the court. And so I think we can start with how we conduct our hearings. We can start also with how we conduct our investigations. I mean, for example, the president always has the authority to nominate, but they also have the authority to control the investigations into the backgrounds of their nominees, which means that they can keep out evidence that suggests that this person is not fit for the court. And so there are lots of ways that we can have intervention on the part of the presidency. One, just having a open and fair investigation into the lives of the people who they nominate, instead of trying to control those nominates to fit the agenda of an organization that has said that they're there to put in only conservative people on the court.
Well, you certainly learned a lot. However, you know, I seem to recall, this just occurred to me, a conversation that you and I had not long after you testified, which was that you were surprised the extent to which actually politics wasn't the only element. I remember you saying that people crossed the aisle actually because they really were more interested in being close to the power of the president, that there were Democrats who let you down. You recall that?
Yeah, well, one of them happened to be my senator from the state of Oklahoma. But I think what that hearing said, I mean, people like to think that it was about the politics of the left and people like Joe Biden and Ted Kennedy. And that was how they were framing it, as a political event. And they were not taking into account that the question of sexual harassment, which was really what the conversation should have been about, and whether that kind of behavior disqualified an individual from sitting on the court. So it wasn't about a political choice necessarily, if they had looked at it through that lens of whether or not this is the kind of behavior that you want to endorse for a person who is going to sit on the court in a lifetime appointment and will ultimately be hearing those cases. Cases of sexual harassment were, rising. The number of complaints were starting to rise. And what you were seeing was the court deciding that they would, or the Senate deciding that they would put someone on the court who had been credibly accused of behavior that the law was telling every employer was repulsive and illegal. And so how do you reconcile that? You can't just look at that as this was the Democrats versus the Republicans, because it was, but what it should have been about really all along was the integrity of a candidate to serve on the highest court in the country. And they couldn't seem to wrap their minds around that as being an important issue. The important part, though, is that I think we've come to understand it in a way quite differently than we could even in 1991. The whole idea of sexual harassment is just, it's in the public consciousness in a way that it has never been historically. And it's taken over 30 years since that hearing for us to come to understand that. I hope that at one point in time, if the same kind of questions arise, that we will, in fact, not rely on our politics to inform our decision, but rely on our sense and belief in the integrity of our courts and our representative bodies to make right decisions about who should and should not be sitting in judgment on the Supreme Court. So that's where I'm hopeful that at some point we can get there. I'm hoping that our consciousness has risen to the level that we can get there. And at the very least, we begin to say, well, maybe they could find somebody else because there are other legal minds. It's not like these are the only ones that have. As a matter of fact, I was speaking in one university, and I won't say where it was. Oh, it was, yeah. I won't say. But the person said to me, I don't know why you were complaining about sexual harassment, when there was really nothing wrong with it. And even if Clarence Thomas wasn't put on the court, they would just get somebody else to do it. Well, yes, they should have just gotten somebody else to do it, because surely they didn't think that everybody was doing it, and therefore, he may as well be as good as anyone. But if you fast forward to today, I knew you were going to say. I knew
Go
that.
ahead.
Yeah, because if you
it.
fast forward to today, there have been decisions made about improprieties in the last few weeks. Well, not about improprieties. It should have been about improprieties. Decisions have made to appoint people in positions of high authority that should never have gone the way that they did. And that really is about politics. It's not about the integrity of the positions. It's not about the best interests of the country that would like to believe that we are better than the violence that we perpetuate based on people's gender and sexual identities and race, but really about the integrity of our laws and the people who will then stand in line or stand in front of a Supreme Court justice and raise their hand and take an oath to the Constitution.
Well, this leads me to a student question. What is the president's responsibility for addressing harassment and violence against women? Or how should survivors and allies respond to presidential indifference to the problem?
Well, I think survivors and allies, and that I hope that includes a lot of the allies part, at the very least includes a lot of folks here. Unfortunately, it includes too many. Survivors includes far too many people. I think that we need to make this part of our conscious effort to decide who we want to lead us, instead of just assuming that it's okay, or if someone has a reputation or is accused of abusive behavior, and then assuming that won't have any impact on their job performance or the public's understanding or confidence in them. I think we've got to make this an issue that we will vote about, that we will lobby about, that we will expect that our representatives will take seriously and do something about. I will say that, and it seems to me odd, really, when you think about it, for all the talk that we have done about sexual harassment and then other forms of abuse and violence, it wasn't until the election of Joe Biden that we had a national plan to end gender-based violence. I mean, no president looked at that problem as a problem that exists in the government offices and that exists throughout society that needs to be addressed in a way that is inclusive of all of the ways that our different government agencies can respond to it, but certainly in terms of how we need to be responding to it from the point of view of the Justice Department, from the point of view of education, from the point of view of housing, from the point of view of employment. All of those areas are impacted by this behavior. And those are some agencies that automatically ought to be brought into the conversation. But that shouldn't limit the conversation, because you have evidence of harassment in just about every governmental agency. If you look at, this should be a top priority to the Department of Defense, because we've seen what has happened in our militaries, in just about every force, whether it's the Air Force or the Army or the Navy. The numbers are there. The harassment exists, and they can ultimately be quite deadly. We know that. And so we now have that template as of the Biden administration as a way for starting to address this problem. We don't, though, it was a presidential, it wasn't an executive order, but it was a presidential effort. So we're not going to expect to see it in the Trump administration.
Right. So what about this political moment? It's a student question. What does this political moment tell us about where we are with gender violence and inequalities? And then that leads to what can we do?
Any concern is tenuous. Any concern is tenuous. It's temporary. It's not embedded in our policies. And that's what we need to have, embedded attention, so that it doesn't change from president to president, that it becomes part of our systems. And that's what we should be moving for. But right now, it's just piecemeal. And we need really a thorough understanding of how all of our efforts, all of our governmental efforts, can be impacted by this problem. The other thing, though, that I've just finished up a research project about the role that allies and survivors, for the first time ever, when you poll survivors, they have said, we are now in a position to make this a presidential issue. We can use this as our vote. Now, people say, well, that's just one issue. Well, the economy is just one issue. And the question is, which issue is important to you? Which issue is important to the well-being of this country? And saying that gender-based violence and ending gender-based violence and having an agenda that will cover not only the people who are here and who have experienced the problem, but who also the people who we can prevent from having to experience the problem. then that's an agenda that we need for this country. The numbers are just atrocious and
let me just
fully
ask you-
embarrassing for
Let me
our
just
country.
ask you, because when you say it in relationship to the economy, maybe we need to go a little bit deeper in terms of what it costs the country. I don't mean money, but what does it cost the fabric of our society to have humans who are, because it could be women or men or non-binary people, right? To have them vulnerable to harassment.
Well, it's costing. First of all, it is costing money. Let's be frank. It's costing money. But it's costing as well. If we put aside the money, it's costing our claim that we are a country that follows the rule of law. I mean, most of the behavior that we're talking, some of it is criminally chargeable. The other is chargeable under employment and civil rights laws. But we do not vigorously enforce those laws on whether it's criminal or civil. And so how can we continue to say that we are a country that abides the rule of law, this is our guiding point, this is our North Star, if in fact we allow this kind of behavior to happen and do nothing about it? Or make assumptions that, well, this is just the way life is, and this is the way it's going to be.
But what do we do about the fact that, of the leadership we have now in that regard?
Well, this is when we get into the politics of it. When you start to look at the people who are voting for people whose credentials are poor at best, and then add on to that their indifference to abusive behavior that have been part of their own reputations and own, well-known, or at least behavior that should have been fully investigated and exposed. How do you then look at a person, a representative who has voted to confirm that person and simply say, well, it's okay because they're taking care of the economy, when you know that this is affecting the economy? It's affecting our health. I mean, that's we think about, one of the things that we think about is when people are abused, there are not only health consequences, but there are housing consequences, there are work consequences. I mean, there's so many ways that this is not an individual problem. This is a social problem. And we need to have responses that takes into account all of those variables. And we also need to be able and willing to go to the people who vote to confirm people who are accused credibly, and say, I'm going to run for your seat, or I'm going to vote for so-and-so because of this particular vote. And I'm tired of people being told that, they're one-issue ponies, or that this is, not the most important thing that can happen, or the most important thing that we as a country need to attend to. And how can you really say that when you know that the risk of your family member or someone you know and love is that they will experience this problem at some point over their lifetime, and in many cases, on more than one occasion.
Well, there's something very practical about how you're thinking about this. And I want to look at a little bit more.
Well, can I just say this?
Yeah.
Because this is a moment, really. You know, we've seen the roster of folks who have now been approved for high positions in this government. How far are we willing to go to say that this should never have happened and it should never happen again? Now, I think we have said that about different people over the course of history. But I guess what it comes down to is, are we willing to say it now, knowing that what we know, knowing that we may not even have been allowed to know everything, are we willing to say, we're just going to let it pass?
Well, say something about courage. I mean, certainly that's also what you represent. Because you stood up, because you spoke up, all of us, a lot of people were not born in this room, but a lot of us were riveted for what, in fact, was, how many days was it actually? Felt like a month.
It did. It felt like longer than that to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, the hearing itself was approximately 3 days.
So 3 days. And
Yeah.
So one of the things you told me a long time ago is that people would walk up to you on the street and say, "Oh my God, you're Anita Hill. I watched the whole thing," as though they did something.
Yeah, yeah. That was what they did. That's all they did.
That's a serious problem about us.
Right.
And you told me that in the 90s. It's an even more serious problem about us
Right.
now, is that we think we're doing something by watching things and tweeting, not tweeting about, talking about it, sending funny jokes about it. But what's that problem? I watched the whole thing.
Yeah. Well, that's what satisfies people. I mean, it's just, and for some people, it really was, no pun intended, theater. I mean, it was the theater of it. It wasn't the real message and heart of it. It wasn't the questions it raised about the integrity of our governing bodies. It was really about, for a lot of people, it was just about what they like to say, he said, she said, almost soap opera, as opposed to about people's lives.
But also, what about the theater of your performance, right? Many people commented on that, on your performance. And I don't know, I should probably not say this.
You
because I should-
commented on my performance.
I did.
Well, yes.
Everybody did, but everybody said how composed.
But everybody's not you.
Everybody said how composed you were, and I probably shouldn't let this cat out of the bag, and I should save it for the play. But I can't help having you tell folks why, having gone to charm school in Oklahoma,
Well, it was.
helped you out up there.
It wasn't actually a school. It was a series of meetings to
it was still
improve
about
on my charm.
It was about
It was
charm.
about charm. And the one thing that I got from charm school was never put your hands above your neck.
Did y'all know about that?
Yeah,
Young
that's
ladies?
right. Yes, the composed ladies do not raise their hands above their neck. And it happened at one point in the hearings when I was probably wiping, something on my face, or, my nose was probably shiny or something, and the cameras flashed. And as though this is the moment she's going to fall apart. And and after that, I never raised my hands above my neck. I never drank water. I never moved anywhere because I knew that would become part of the spectacle, and interpreted in ways that should never have been interpreted. But they were looking, even journalists were looking for that spectacle. They weren't just covering the news. They were looking for that story, that political story for the most part, about, it was mostly about a man who had his position threatened by a woman. And that was the story people were telling in Washington, D.C. Someone's career is being threatened. It wasn't, the journalists were not talking about this as a issue of people's lives, except through his lens.
Well,
And which does bring us to this moment, which is how I think we got certain nominees sitting in high offices. Because it's not about the importance of the work that needs to be done. It's about individuals' careers and being able to be positioned in places of power. And that's where we have to really rethink our politics, but also rethink how we got to the point of not having trust in the courts.
well, when you talk about power and careers, and here we are in one of the finest institutions of learning in the world, what would you say to the educators here who are launching many students into positions of power, whether that's in Washington, whether it's in medicine, whether it's in the nonprofit world? How would you ask us, and I'm still teaching too, how would you ask us to use our opportunity with these young individuals who are being launched into what you would suggest needs to be more than a career?
Well, yeah, with leadership, it's a question of leadership versus power. And I think that's one of the things that we need to get young people to understand, that it's not just about taking a job because it puts you next to or in positions of power. That we're really teaching people to contribute not just to themselves, but to the overall society, however it's measured, whether it's global, and it is increasingly global, but it's certainly local and national in this country. That especially when we see the divisiveness and the chaos of the day. But I also think that as educators, we need to be truly concerned about the assault on higher education. The idea that higher education is toxic and that it needs to be completely disruptive. When you have that be sort of like the pet project, I think of the vice president. It is dismantling educational institutions. I think what does that say to our students? What does it say to our future students? And how can we really reclaim our position in society where so many of the institutions seem to be on the downside of any kind of sense of trust and confidence? I see this more as an attack on knowledge and change than it is on any kind of deficit, any other deficit that people are claiming exists in educational institutions. I think it's not. I think it's about a sense that it's almost like what has happened with the courts, that you have now a powerful effort to displace the voices in education with more conservative voices and more conservative leadership and ideologies. It's not simply that, the universities express one ideology. That's not what this movement is about. It's about shifting to a 6-3 court, a 6-3, presumption that the majority of folks who are in education should be teaching conservatism. Now, you could say that's fine, but I would say that knowing that I've been in education now for I've taught since 1983. I know, scary. Yeah, I've been teaching for years. And as I said, I've taught at Oral Roberts University, and I've taught at Brandeis. And I don't know of a time where there was an open effort just to change or push for a shift in terms of the kind of knowledge that we can produce, the kind of research that we can do, the kinds of topics that we can teach in our classrooms. I think this is really a dangerous moment for us. And I think we really have to resist this on every turn, because I think it can sweep across. So let's just take the SFFA versus Harvard case. We have a case now about consideration of race in admissions processes. And we have been told that that is no longer the case. We have had now that case enlarged in the minds of conservative politicians around the country. They have, in that sense, not only taken over the admissions processes, but they are also taking over about every other function that we have in a university, or attempting to take that over. And it will not benefit education. It will not benefit young people in the next generation of leaders. And we can't afford really to lose the kind of knowledge that we have gained over the last couple of decades that have really improved our thinking, I believe improved our thinking about the world that we live in today, a complex world that we live in today. And so I'm concerned about that because it will hit a whole range of issues that SFFA versus Harvard was never intended. And it will allow for discrimination on the basis of the very classes that they're saying that, the discrimination no longer exists. It's going to allow for more discrimination as opposed to allowing for less discrimination.
People are walking around making me nervous about time. How much time do I have? Okay. I mean, you would have no idea, because I'm facing this way, and they're looking at their watches, moving around. And there's a security
Maybe they were
guard.
just
I'm like,
looking at
okay.
looking at the watches, saying, "How long is this answer going to be?"
No. No, they're just walking around, and I should have probably asked for a timer or something so I could be more independent. But nonetheless, so many years ago, I asked you and interviewed you and performed you in one of my plays with a question about home. I asked you about how you feel at home, and I wonder if this can be relevant particularly to students who I've found in my 50 years of teaching have become increasingly concerned about having a sense of belonging wherever they are. Now, a lot of that's going to go out the window with the attention to that's going to go out the window with what you just described. But so the idea, I think, of home is also about belongingness. And there's something very active and I think useful in what you said to me when I interviewed you for my play House Arrest and asked you where you feel at home. And this is what you said. I'm not going to act like you. I'm just going to read it, okay? So don't worry. I feel like I have a very limited space. And it's really limited to my physical home. But just the house. Just the house. To some extent, I'm more at home in Norman than I am any place. It was just bizarre yesterday. The first thing I did, I went to a place to get a cup of coffee. And the woman behind the counter said, "What is your name?" As though she was interrogating me, as though I was some kind of an imposter. She said, "Well, I heard that you hadn't been in Norman in a long time." And so, what I thought was my home, in some ways, has been taken away from me by these myths that go around. So even in the town that I thought was my home, I can't go in and be completely anonymous and completely relaxed. I still have to deal with the question about who I am and what I'm doing here. I think that home is as much psychological and spiritual as it is physical. To the extent that I am at peace here now, it's not because this place has fulfilled the promises we thought it would. It's because I have fulfilled the promises and lived up to its limitations. I found that very instructive, and I carry it with me to this day, because I understand that I have and have to create my own belongingness. And I think so many Americans do believe in the promise. What's the work of fulfilling the promise for yourself and for others is the question I'd like to end with.
Wow. Well, first of all, you have to fulfill what you believe is your home. You have to create that space for yourself, and it can be just your own physical house, or it can be your town or your community or neighborhood. I mean, it doesn't even have to be physical. It can be a part of a community that is virtual, that includes a lot of different folks. But you have to find that in yourself in order for you to be able to begin to build it in the lives of others. One of the things that I love about teaching is that every time, in every year that I have taught, I have found that there are students who feel they do not belong in the space where they are learning or attempting to learn. And I have taken on, since I do have a better sense of where I belong now, and that I do belong in an educational institution. I do have that sense. And I've taken on really the role of making sure that I instill that, or at least give them a little more belief that they belong as well, that they are meant to be where they are, and that they can grow and prosper even in those locations that once seemed at least indifferent to them. And so that is something I think that we can all commit to, whether it's in an educational institution or another kind of workplace or some other kind of affiliation that we have. One of the things that I will just close with that I think is really kind of related to the entire conversation is, how do we address this moment in time, and what are we looking for from our leaders, from the people who are running things, not just this new regime, because it's a 4-year term, but really, how do we focus our belief? How do we believe that we can do better? And I keep going back to this time when it was 1974, so I was much younger, but I watched on television Barbara Jordan, Congresswoman Barbara Jordan.
Extraordinary moment in American history.
Right. And what she said about what was the source of her strength, her integrity, was the Constitution. And that her belief in the Constitution was complete and whole, and she would not stand by idly as a spectator watching the destruction of the Constitution and the rule of law. That moment, for me, says what we need to know about leading in this country even now. I mean, the amazing thing about that was that she was a junior representative. She was one of 2 women on a 37-member panel for the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And she, instead of taking this as a political moment, she took this as a moment that was calling into question our commitment to the rule of law. Even with all of its flaws, she understood that we needed to understand that we are all part of we the people that's written in the Constitution. But we can't just be making decisions based on the political whims of the moment. That our decisions have to be grounded in something that is critical to who we are as a country. And this is where we are now. And I just, it's the statement that I'm referring to was a statement that all of those 37 members had to give a statement for the impeachment. Hers was, I think, the next to the last because she was like the second most junior. And it was the statement that actually framed the thinking of that impeachment panel. I just invite you to look back on that moment. And historians will say that that was a game-changing moment for the public that was watching this on television. And how she was able to do it, this young Black woman in Texas, relying on the ability to lead, that she was sure that she had it right, and taking a stand and moving the country where it needed to be. I don't know that we can have that moment now because the times are different and influences are different, but it is.
Well, you never know. I mean, I think
But you never know.
I think we shouldn't say that we can't have it. I mean, I think that be ready.
Yeah.
Be ready because, I mean, she happened to have been the daughter of a great preacher.
Right.
And she happened to have an extraordinary voice and all of that. But back to a word I used early on in our conversation, courage. Be ready.
Right.
Because you never know, like Professor Hill, when you will be called to speak. Please thank Professor Hill for all she's done and what she's doing right now.
We could not be more thrilled to have brought the 2024 election series to a close with such an incredible conversation, and you've more than fulfilled the promise.
And thank you, Anna, for leading me there.
Please join me in thanking Professor Hill and Anna Deavere Smith for being with us tonight, and thank you again to our wonderful co-sponsors for helping to make this happen. Please stay in your seats so that we can let our guests exit first. But thank you again to our audience for joining us. We hope to see you at our upcoming public programs. Governor Josh Stein will be joining us in conversation on February 28th, and Neil Katyal and Senator Welch will be joining us on March 1st. Good night, everyone.